It began in the heart of New York City, on a night when the city's glittering lights promised nothing but ease for the wealthy who walked its streets. The air outside carried the scent of roasted chestnuts and car horns, but inside the walls of the Mariner's Pearl, one of Manhattan's most expensive seafood restaurants, there was silence the moment she approached their table. She balanced the tray carefully, every step rehearsed, every smile practiced. To anyone else, Danielle Brooks was just a waitress, 27 years old, hair pulled neatly back, a pressed uniform hiding the wear of double shifts and long subway rides. But in this moment, the dining floor was not her workplace. It was a stage. Every eye followed her, though most pretended not to notice. And seated at the center of that stage was Richard Caldwell, a billionaire CEO, a man whose name opened doors on Wall Street and closed them for anyone who dared cross him. He leaned back in his chair with the comfort of someone who had never once been asked to prove his worth. Beside him sat Victoria Caldwell, dressed in silk, diamonds at her wrist, her smile sharp as glass. Danielle set down the cutlery. A simple task, a neutral gesture, but it was enough. Victoria's voice cut across the room like broken glass. "Remove her. This is not her place." The words froze the air. For a second it was unclear who she meant. The restaurant manager looked toward the kitchen door, expecting to see a misplaced cart or a busboy lingering too close. But Victoria's eyes, cold, unblinking, were fixed on Danielle. The billionaire chuckled, the kind of laugh men use when they want the world to know they agree with cruelty. And in that moment, Danielle knew two things with absolute clarity. She had been marked, and she had been dismissed. She did not speak. She simply lowered her eyes and stepped back, tray steady in her hand, but her silence did not shield her. For silence is never protection, it is permission. Other diners looked away, returning to their glasses of wine, their oysters chilled over ice. No one wanted to be part of what was happening. No one wanted to risk being the one who objected. And so the room, filled with power and wealth, fell quiet. But behind that quiet, something was shifting. Because humiliation has a way of planting seeds, seeds of questions, of anger, of courage. And though Danielle appeared to retreat, in truth she was calculating, remembering, waiting for her moment. Richard called for the menu. His voice carried authority, demanding attention as though the entire establishment existed to serve his appetite. "Bring me the lobster," he said, barely glancing at Danielle. He was a man used to being obeyed, to ordering both meals and lives without hesitation. Yet what he could not know, what no one at that table could have guessed, was that the most expensive dish in the house would not be the thing to stop him cold. It would be the folded piece of paper she carried in her pocket. And once it reached him, nothing, not his billions, not his name, not his carefully crafted image, would ever be the same again. If you are watching this, and you feel that silence in the face of humiliation is dangerous, then subscribe right now and tell us where you're watching from. Because silence is not safety, it is surrender. And if you choose not to subscribe, go to the comments, confess why, and let the world see why you remained silent when dignity was on the line. The restaurant did not return to normal after Victoria's command. Outwardly, yes. Wine was poured, forks scraped gently against porcelain plates, and laughter rose from tables where bankers and politicians entertained their guests. But underneath, there was a current no one wanted to acknowledge. The kind of current that drags people silently beneath the surface. Danielle stood near the polished bar counter, holding an empty tray, eyes downcast. The uniform she wore was pressed and spotless, but it could not erase the invisible label others had placed upon her. Service, not equal. She had felt that label before, in interviews, in classrooms, even at subway turnstiles where security guards decided, without cause, that her bag should be searched. But tonight, the label was sharper. It had been spoken aloud for everyone to hear. Richard sipped his wine as if nothing had happened. To him, it was routine. The world was divided into those who served and those who commanded. His wife's cruelty was not unusual. It was an extension of how they lived. The table was theirs, the restaurant was theirs, even the silence of those who witnessed was theirs. And yet, power is never singular. It bends, it layers, it shifts depending on who holds the gaze. Tonight, it wore many faces. It wore the face of wealth. Richard's custom-tailored suit, cut to perfection by an Italian designer whose waiting list stretched months. The gold cufflinks he adjusted absent-mindedly, each engraved with his initials, gleamed brighter than the overhead chandeliers. To Danielle, those details were not just fashion, they were reminders of a world built to exclude. It wore the face of status, Victoria Caldwell's presence itself, a socialite whose name was printed in glossy magazines, photographed stepping out of black cars in couture gowns. The kind of woman who knew every maitre d' in Manhattan by name, and whose disdain could end careers with a whisper. It wore the face of authority, the restaurant manager, torn between pleasing the Caldwells and protecting his staff. His silence was not neutrality, it was allegiance. He knew whose favor mattered most. And finally, it wore the face of gender bias. Victoria's attack was not just about race or class, it was a warning about space. Who could sit, who could serve, who could exist without intrusion in the circles of power. Danielle, however, was no stranger to layers. She had lived them, navigated them, been crushed by them, and yet survived. And as she stood there, quiet but watchful, she understood something no one else in that room did. The more layers power hides beneath, the more fragile it becomes when someone dares to pull just one away. Richard glanced up, and for the briefest second their eyes met. His, dismissive, hers, unwavering. It was a moment too quick for anyone else to notice, but in that fraction of time, a message passed silently between them. He believed her powerless. She knew something he did not. The room remained filled with chatter, the clinking of crystal glasses, the fragrance of butter and garlic carried from the kitchen, but beneath it all, an invisible weight pressed down on the table at the center of the room. Because humiliation was not the end of this encounter, it was only the beginning. And soon, Richard Caldwell would discover that the woman his wife tried to erase from the dining room had come with more than menus and trays. She had come with truth. Truth that could not be ignored. Truth that could not be buried under cufflinks, or titles, or bank accounts. Truth, folded neatly, waiting in her pocket. The silverware gleamed. The lobster knives had been laid out with precision, shining under the golden chandeliers. From every corner of the room, luxury spoke in subtle tones. Imported wine racks, velvet drapes, polished wood carved by hand. But what echoed most clearly was not the decor. It was the silence. Dozens of eyes had seen it. Victoria's command, Richard's laugh, Danielle's humiliation. They had watched it unfold like theater, yet none had spoken. Not the bankers with their cigars, not the couples celebrating anniversaries, not the staff who had memorized the menu by heart. Every witness chose silence, and silence in rooms like this is not absence. Silence is alliance. Silence is surrender. Silence is the invisible contract that says, let the powerful do as they will, and let the rest of us keep our heads down. But silence has consequences. Danielle knew it. Richard did not. And every person listening to this story now must face the same question. In that room, would you have stood for her or sat in silence with the others? If you are watching this, and you believe that silence in the face of humiliation is as dangerous as the insult itself, subscribe right now and tell us where you are watching from. Because silence protects the cruel, it never protects the victim. And if you choose not to subscribe, go to the comments and confess why. Let the world see the reason you stayed silent when you could have spoken. The camera, if it were there, would linger not on the glitter of the Caldwell's table, But on Danielle's steady hands gripping the tray at her side, she was silent in that moment, yes. But unlike the others, her silence was not consent. Her silence was preparation, because the words she carried did not need to be spoken aloud. They were already written, folded, and waiting. And when Richard Caldwell reached for the lobster he had so casually demanded, he would find more than he had ordered. He would find himself staring at a secret he thought had been buried 3 years ago. Richard Caldwell leaned back, his chair creaking softly against the polished hardwood floor. With a flick of his wrist, he summoned the head waiter. His tone was not a request, it was a decree. "The lobster," he said. "The largest one you have. Bring it out." The waiter nodded, bowed, and hurried toward the kitchen. Richard smirked, swirling the deep red wine in his glass. He did not ask the price. He did not need to. Price was for men who counted their money. Richard was a man who counted other men's failures. Victoria dabbed her lips with a silk napkin, eyes gliding across the dining room like a queen surveying her court. "At least," she murmured to her husband, "they know how to treat us properly here." Her words carried no subtlety, aimed to remind Danielle that her presence was unwanted. Danielle's hands trembled slightly as she set fresh glasses at the table. Trembled, but did not falter. To the casual eye, she was still just another waitress performing her duty. But beneath the calm surface, her thoughts moved like water pressing against a dam. Each insult, each laugh, each moment of dismissal had built the pressure higher, and now the dam was ready to crack. In her apron pocket lay a single folded sheet of paper. No one else knew it was there. Not the other waiters rushing between tables, not the manager watching nervously from the corner, not even Danielle's best friend in the kitchen who had urged her to just let it go when she whispered her plan. The paper was not long, only a few words, hastily written. But words can be heavier than stones. Words can break empires. When the lobster arrived, glistening under a layer of butter and steam, Richard leaned forward like a man about to claim his prize. Danielle approached the table with steady steps, the platter balanced perfectly, the scent of garlic filling the air. The other diners glanced up just for a moment, their curiosity drawn not to the dish, but to the man who had ordered it. To be in the same room as Richard Caldwell was, in some circles, a privilege. He was the kind of man others imitated, his haircut, his watch, his investments. He was the man magazines called indispensable. But as Danielle lowered the plate onto the linen tablecloth, she did something none of them would have dared. With a practiced grace, as natural as refilling a glass, she slid the folded note beneath the porcelain dish. Her movement was invisible, disguised as routine. Victoria's eyes never left her reflection in the silver spoon she lifted. Richard's gaze was already on the lobster claws cracking beneath the waiter's tool. Only Danielle knew what had just changed. She stepped back. Hands empty now, heart racing, her chest rising and falling as though she had just run a mile. She did not look at Richard again. She only turned, collected her tray, and walked toward the shadows near the bar. Seconds later, Richard lifted his fork, then paused. Something caught his attention. A corner of paper, barely visible, peeking from under the dish. He frowned, sliding the lobster aside just enough to free it. A note. He unfolded it slowly, careful not to draw Victoria's notice. His eyes scanned the words, and in an instant, the color drained from his face. The man who had laughed moments ago, the man whose arrogance had filled the room, sat frozen. His hand tightened around the slip of paper until it shook. Whatever he had just read did not belong in this glittering restaurant. It did not belong in the world of silk gowns and diamond bracelets. It belonged to something else, something buried, something he thought was gone. Richard swallowed hard, his throat dry. He looked up, searching the room, and his eyes landed on Danielle. She stood at a distance, her posture calm, her face unreadable. But her eyes told him everything. She knew. And Richard Caldwell, billionaire CEO, a man feared in boardrooms and revered in headlines, suddenly realized he was not the most powerful person in the room anymore. He held the note in his hand, but the weight of it pressed against his entire life. And though no one else could see the words, Richard knew. His past had just followed him into this room. The question was no longer what the waitress had served him. The question was how long she had been waiting to strike. Richard Caldwell stared at the note, his hand trembling ever so slightly. He was careful, so careful, that Victoria wouldn't notice. He slipped the paper beneath his palm, pretending to brush a breadcrumb from the tablecloth. Victoria, unaware, was still speaking, her voice polished and sharp. "Honestly, Richard, Chicago is tolerable at best. Next week, let's just fly back to New York. This city has nothing left to offer us." Her tone was light, dismissive, but every word grated against Richard's skull like sandpaper. He couldn't hear her, not really. All he could hear was the echo of the words scrawled on that folded sheet. Words only Danielle, and he, seemed to know. He reached for his wine, lifting the crystal glass to mask the shake in his wrist. But the taste of it was different now, metallic, bitter. He set it down too quickly, the stem clinking against the table. Victoria raised an eyebrow. "Careful, Richard. You'll stain the tablecloth. And these people, they notice everything." But she was wrong. The diners around them did not notice him at all. They noticed her dress, her posture, her earrings that glittered under the chandelier. Richard had built an empire, but in rooms like this, it was Victoria they looked at. And yet, someone had noticed him, someone who had slipped a truth under his plate, someone who had watched him closely enough to know what would stop him cold. Across the room, Danielle stood near the bar, arranging glasses that did not need arranging. Her hands moved, but her eyes were steady, locked on him with an unsettling patience. Richard's chest tightened. He thought of boardrooms where men twice his age had folded under his stare. He thought of senators who had bent their will after one phone call from him, and yet this waitress, in her plain black uniform, stood with a power he couldn't explain. What did she know? How could she know? The note burned in his pocket now, hidden from sight but impossible to ignore. Victoria leaned forward, lowering her voice to a hiss. "Richard, you're sweating. What's wrong with you?" He forced a smile that convinced no one. "It's nothing. Just the wine. Stronger than I expected." Victoria rolled her eyes. "You're a terrible liar." But she didn't press further. She had learned long ago that when Richard shut a door, it stayed shut. Still, she could sense something, and her suspicion clung to the air between them. At that moment, Danielle approached again. Her steps were slower this time, deliberate. She carried no tray, no glasses, nothing at all. She stopped just at the edge of their table, her shadow falling across the white linen. "Is everything to your satisfaction, Mr. Caldwell?" she asked, her voice low, steady. The question was ordinary, but the way she said his name, it wasn't. It was a test, a reminder. Richard's pulse pounded in his ears. He wanted to dismiss her, to wave her away, but his throat betrayed him. He cleared it, forcing words out. "Yes, perfectly fine." Danielle held his gaze for a second too long, then nodded and stepped back. Victoria's eyes narrowed. "Why does she keep looking at you like that?" Richard snapped, sharper than he intended. "Like what?" "Like she knows you." Silence fell between them, the kind of silence that can split open a marriage. Victoria's suspicions hardened into something sharper. Richard's anxiety deepened into something darker. And Danielle? She walked away, her face calm, her pace unhurried, as though she had just placed the first piece in a game neither of them could escape. Richard pressed his hand into his pocket, fingers brushing the folded note again. He thought of shredding it, thought of tearing it into 1,000 pieces and scattering them across the restaurant floor, but even if the words disappeared, the meaning would not. For words like these were not written to be forgotten. They were written to be answered. Richard knew then that this was not the end of something. It was the beginning. And as Danielle vanished into the shadows near the kitchen, he realized the game had only one question: how far was she willing to go, and how much was he willing to lose to keep his secret buried? Richard Caldwell was a man who prided himself on control of numbers, control of people, control of outcomes. But control is fragile, and it often slips not with a bang, but with the faintest tremor. That tremor began the very next morning. Richard sat in his penthouse office overlooking Michigan Avenue, the glass walls stretching skyward like monuments to his own success. Normally, this view steadied him, but today, even the skyline felt hostile, the buildings leaning in, whispering judgment. He had locked the note inside the top drawer of his desk, folded so tightly it was little more than a creased fragment of paper, yet he could feel it, even through the wood, as if it pulsed with a heartbeat of its own. His assistant, Claire, entered with her usual briskness. "You've got the press at 10, then a board call at noon. Also, the Tribune's requesting a statement about the housing deal in Englewood." Richard waved her off. "Later." Claire frowned. "They've already printed half a page. People are asking why the deal's stalled. You know how this looks." "I said later." His voice cracked like a whip, and Claire stopped mid-sentence. She left the office without another word, but not without a look. That look, the one that said she knew something was off. Richard leaned back in his chair, his pulse quickening. Every glance now felt like an accusation, every question a trap. The note's words echoed, though he tried to block them out. By mid-morning, the cracks widened. At the press conference, reporters gathered in the sleek hotel ballroom. The air buzzed with cameras and murmurs. Richard usually commanded such rooms effortlessly, but today his tie felt like a noose, his collar too tight. He stood behind the podium, lights glaring into his eyes. "Our expansion project," he began, voice steady but flat, "represents not just growth for Caldwell Industries, but a brighter future for Chicago." A hand shot up from the second row. "Mr. Caldwell, reports suggest your company pushed out several minority-owned businesses from that very site. Care to comment?" The room shifted. Cameras clicked. Richard froze, the note's words flashing in his mind like lightning. He stumbled through an answer, something vague about market forces and long-term prosperity. But his tone wavered, and the crowd smelled blood. Another voice rose. "Do you think the public deserves to know more about your dealings in Englewood?" The walls closed in. He could see Danielle's eyes in the crowd, though she wasn't there. He could hear her voice, though she hadn't spoken. The questions multiplied, and for the first time in years, Richard Caldwell looked like a man caught, not commanding. By the time he left the stage, Victoria was waiting in the corridor. She was livid. "What was that? You looked rattled." Richard snapped. "It was nothing. Reporters always push." "Don't lie to me." Her tone cut deeper than the questions had, for if Victoria was doubting him, then his fortress had a hole, and once a hole appears, it spreads. That night, alone in the penthouse, Richard poured himself a drink. The city stretched beneath him, but the view offered no comfort. He opened the desk drawer, staring at the folded note once more. He read the words again, every letter a wound. And then he noticed something he hadn't before. At the bottom, beneath the scrawl, was a faint impression. A second set of words, almost invisible, pressed into the paper as if written with a lighter hand. He tilted the page toward the lamplight, and slowly the ghost of the hidden message revealed itself. It wasn't just a warning, it was an address in Englewood. Richard's blood ran cold. For the first time, the note gave him a direction. Danielle hadn't just shaken his peace of mind. She had left him a trail. But to what? A truth buried in concrete, a debt he thought forgotten, or something darker, waiting for him in the shadows of a neighborhood he had once stripped bare for profit. He folded the note again, but the damage was done. There was no unreading it. The empire was cracking, and the next move was hers. Richard Caldwell had not driven through Englewood in over a decade. For him it wasn't a neighborhood, it was a shadow, the kind of place people like him only spoke of in statistics, reports, and real estate valuations. But now, the address on that note pulled him back. The black SUV rolled past blocks of boarded storefronts, murals painted on crumbling walls, and the faint smell of smoke lingering from fires that had burned out long ago. His driver glanced at him in the rearview mirror, waiting for instructions, but Richard said nothing. His eyes were fixed outside, where every street corner seemed to accuse him of something he'd rather forget. Finally, the car stopped at a corner where the pavement cracked like scars. The address matched the building ahead, a narrow brick structure with barred windows and a faded sign that once read Southside Community Center. Richard remembered it too well. Years ago, it had been alive. Children running in and out, basketballs bouncing on the cracked court out back, volunteers handing out food boxes and books. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a heartbeat in a neighborhood starved of hope. And then, he had taken it. Through backroom deals and silent signatures, the center had been shuttered. His company had promised redevelopment, promised jobs, promised investment. But the land had sat vacant for years, swallowed into his real estate portfolio, then leveraged, flipped, and forgotten. Richard stepped out of the SUV, his shoes crunching glass on the sidewalk. The building loomed over him, empty now, windows like blind eyes staring. He tried to tell himself it was just business. That's what he had always said, just business. But as he stood there, the weight of memory pressed harder. Because it hadn't been just business, not when he had stood in this very spot and watched families plead with him to reconsider. Not when a young woman, her name on the tip of his tongue, had begged him not to take away the only safe place for their children. He swallowed hard. He could almost hear her voice again. And then, it hit him. That voice. It was hers. Danielle. The realization froze him in place. The waitress in the restaurant, the one who had slipped him the note, had once stood right here, fighting to keep this building alive. He hadn't recognized her then. But she had recognized him. Richard turned slowly, scanning the street. Every shadow felt alive, every passerby a witness. The door of the center creaked open. He hadn't noticed anyone there, but now a figure stood in the doorway. An older man, his shoulders stooped, his eyes wary. "You shouldn't be here," the man said flatly. Richard cleared his throat. I used to own this property." The man laughed bitterly. "Used to. You still do. Nothing's changed, except now it's a graveyard." The words stung, heavier than they should. Richard shifted uncomfortably, about to step back toward the SUV, when he noticed something carved into the doorframe. Letters, etched deep into the wood. He leaned closer. The carving read, "We remember." 3 words, but they cut deeper than any accusation. Richard staggered back, his chest tight. He wanted to leave, to climb into the SUV and pretend this visit never happened. But then the older man spoke again. "She told us you'd come." Richard froze. "What did you say?" "She told us, Danielle. Said one day you'd show your face again. Said we shouldn't be surprised." Richard's pulse thundered. She hadn't just left him a note. She had set a trap. A message that had led him straight into the past he'd tried to bury. The man pointed to the side of the building. "You want answers? Look there." Richard hesitated, but his legs carried him forward. Around the corner, the brick wall stretched long and bare, except for one thing, a mural. It was fresh, painted in vibrant colors. It showed children playing, a community smiling, a building alive again. And in the corner, signed in bold letters, were 2 words. "For Danielle." Richard's throat went dry. This wasn't just a memory. This was a resurrection. She hadn't forgotten. She hadn't forgiven. And now, she was reminding everyone. Richard stumbled back toward the SUV, his hands shaking. The note had led him here, to a graveyard of his own making. But what he didn't know, not yet, was that the past wasn't done with him. For somewhere in Englewood, Danielle wasn't just waiting. She was planning, and the cracks in his empire were about to split wide open. Richard Caldwell had built his empire on decisions, quick ones, ruthless ones, the kind of decisions that crushed hesitation, because hesitation was weakness. But for the first time in years, he hesitated. That night, back in his penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, he sat alone at the marble bar, a half-empty glass of bourbon clutched in his hand. The city sparkled beneath him, but it no longer felt like his. It felt borrowed, fragile, as if one gust of truth could topple the whole skyline. The mural haunted him. The words carved into the doorframe haunted him. But above all, Danielle haunted him. She wasn't just a waitress. She wasn't just a woman with a note. She was a ghost from a past he thought he had erased, and now she was living, breathing proof that some debts don't vanish. He replayed her face in his mind. Calm, unyielding. She hadn't threatened him with rage or spectacle. No, she had threatened him with something far worse, quiet certainty. The kind of certainty that spreads like wildfire once it finds oxygen. Richard poured another drink, his hands trembling just enough to spill a drop across the counter. He didn't bother to wipe it away. His phone buzzed, a message from Victoria. "We need to talk, tonight." Of course. She had seen him falter at the press conference, seen the cracks. Victoria was no fool. She knew when something was slipping, and if she pressed hard enough, she would find the truth. But Victoria wasn't the threat. Not yet. Danielle was. And that's where the dilemma sharpened like a blade. One path was simple. Find Danielle, confront her, silence her before she could speak louder. Richard had done it before, in different ways. Not with violence, but with contracts, with threats, with money that made problems disappear. The other path was dangerous. Meet her not as a billionaire, not as an untouchable figure, but as a man, exposed, admitting what he had done. It would mean risk. It would mean surrender. And Richard Caldwell had never surrendered to anyone. He rose from the bar and crossed to his desk, pulling open the drawer once again. The note lay there like a loaded weapon. He unfolded it, staring at the words, the address, the faint ghostwriting that had led him back to Englewood. At the bottom, just below the scrawl, he noticed something else he had missed before. A date, written faintly, almost invisible. Friday. 2 nights away. His heart skipped. This wasn't random. This wasn't open-ended. Danielle had given him a deadline. He slammed the drawer shut, pacing the room. His thoughts tangled into knots. If he ignored her, she would escalate. If he tried to bury her, she would resist. And if he met her, what then? The bourbon burned his throat as he drained the glass. He thought of the children from the community center, their faces blurred in memory but their cries still sharp. He thought of the young woman standing on the steps, pleading with him not to take it away. Danielle had been there. She had fought then, and she was fighting still. And for the first time in his life, Richard wondered if he was fighting a battle he couldn't win. His phone buzzed again. Another message. Not from Victoria this time. No name. Just a number he didn't recognize. The text read, "You can't hide forever. Friday, 9 p.m., you know where." Richard's stomach turned. His fingers tightened on the phone until his knuckles whitened. This wasn't just a game anymore. It was an appointment. He set the phone down, his mind racing. If he went, he risked everything. If he didn't, she would make sure he lost it anyway. 2 paths, 2 futures, and both carried ruin. Richard Caldwell stood at the window, staring at the city lights, caught between silence and surrender. The clock was ticking, the date was set, and as Friday drew nearer, one truth became clear. Whatever Danielle had planned would not just decide his fate, it would decide whether his empire crumbled or survived. But which choice would he make, and who would he become when the hour struck? Richard Caldwell had spent his entire life turning tables. Whenever the odds were stacked against him, He simply flipped the board and wrote new rules. And so, 2 nights before the deadline, he decided to do exactly that. He would not wait for Danielle to corner him. He would not walk blindly into her chosen meeting place. No, he would find her first, on his terms. He would confront her, disarm her, end this before it spiraled further. At least, that was the plan. He called in a favor from a private investigator, an old contact who had dug up dirt on business rivals in the past. By midnight, the investigator called back. "She's clean," the voice said. "No criminal record, no lawsuits, nothing you can use. Works at a mid-tier restaurant downtown, lives in a small apartment on the south side, barely gets by." Richard clenched his jaw. That wasn't enough. Everyone had something. A weakness, a secret. All he needed was leverage. "Keep digging," Richard ordered. "I don't care how small it is. Find me something." The following evening he decided to see her for himself. Richard arrived at the restaurant just before closing, his driver waiting in the car. The dining room was nearly empty, the last of the patrons paying their checks. Danielle was there, clearing glasses from a table, her movements unhurried. She didn't see him enter. At least, she pretended not to. For a moment, Richard just watched her. She looked ordinary, tired even, but he knew better. Beneath the uniform was a memory sharper than steel, a knowledge that could undo him. He approached slowly, his shoes echoing on the tile. Danielle looked up. Her expression didn't change. No surprise, no fear, only calm recognition. "Mr. Caldwell," she said evenly, "I was wondering when you'd come." The words cut him. She wasn't startled. She was prepared. He forced a smile, one he used in boardrooms when charm worked better than force. "Danielle, isn't it? I think we should talk." She wiped her hands on a towel and gestured to a table. "Then sit." Richard hesitated. It was backwards. She should have been the one waiting for his invitation. Yet here he was, obeying hers. He sat, leaning forward. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but slipping me that note, it was a mistake." Her eyes didn't waver. "No, Richard. The mistake was yours years ago. Do you even remember what you took from us?" His pulse quickened. "It was business, nothing personal." Danielle leaned closer, her voice dropping. "It was never just business. It was our lives, our children, our home." Richard swallowed hard, but before he could respond, she slid something across the table. A phone. Its screen lit up, showing a video paused at the first frame. "Press play," she said. He didn't move. So she did. The video began. Grainy footage of him, years younger, standing on the steps of the community center. Reporters gathered, microphones extended. He was smiling, declaring the deal a win for everyone. Then the camera panned to the crowd. Faces of the community, shouting, crying, pleading. And there, clear as day, Danielle, younger, her voice rising above the rest. "You're destroying us." The video ended with his smirk, his words. "Progress requires sacrifice." Richard's stomach sank. He remembered that day. He remembered dismissing her as noise. He never thought anyone had recorded it. Danielle took back the phone, her expression calm but edged with fire. "The world forgot, but I didn't, and now I hold the proof." Richard tried to regain ground. "You think a video will ruin me? I've survived worse." She tilted her head. "Maybe. But this isn't just about you. It's about reminding people who you really are. And when the story spreads, you won't be the man who built an empire. You'll be the man who stole one." For the first time, Richard had no script, no rebuttal, no control. She stood, tucking the phone into her pocket. "Friday, 9 o'clock. Be there. If you're not, the world will see everything." And with that, she walked away, leaving him alone at the table. Richard sat frozen, the weight of defeat pressing on him. He had come to flip the board, to reclaim the upper hand. But somehow she had flipped it instead. For the first time in his life, Richard Caldwell wasn't holding the cards, Danielle was. And as he left the restaurant, his empire behind him and the deadline ahead, one truth echoed louder than any. He had underestimated her. And underestimation for men like him was the beginning of the end. Richard Caldwell had always trusted one voice above all others, his own. That voice had carried him from the son of a steelworker to the master of boardrooms. It was confident, calculating, invincible. But now, another voice had taken its place. It began subtly, the night after he met Danielle at the restaurant. He tried to sleep, but the silence pressed too heavily against him. He closed his eyes, but her words echoed in the dark. "Do you even remember what you took from us?" He tossed, turned, reached for the bourbon at his bedside. But when he drifted off at last, the dreams came. The community center, shouts, faces, Danielle's younger voice. Then silence, broken only by his own words, warped, distorted, replayed against him. Progress requires sacrifice. Progress requires sacrifice. Progress requires sacrifice. He woke drenched in sweat, convinced someone had whispered it in his ear. By morning, the paranoia was no longer confined to dreams. At the office, he barked at his staff, suspicious of every glance. Claire, his assistant, placed a folder on his desk. "The contract's for next week, Mr. Caldwell. You'll need to—" "Who else has seen this?" he demanded. Claire blinked. "No one. Just the board." "The board?" His fist slammed the desk. "You mean they've been talking behind my back?" Claire stammered, wide-eyed, but Richard was already shoving the folder aside. The documents blurred in his vision, lines of text twisting into Danielle's handwriting, scrawled across the margins. When he blinked, the handwriting was gone. But the feeling wasn't. He couldn't focus, couldn't trust, couldn't breathe without hearing that question again. By evening, he found himself back at the penthouse, pacing the glass walls as though the city itself were closing in. His reflection in the window stared back at him, not the Richard Caldwell who commanded power, but a man unraveling. And then, the voice grew stronger. It wasn't just Danielle's anymore. It was the crowd, the children, the volunteers from the community center. Every voice he had dismissed as noise had returned, layered atop one another, chanting, accusing, demanding. "We remember. We remember. We remember." He pressed his hands over his ears, but the sound was inside him now. And beneath it all, a whisper, his own, but changed. "You thought you buried us, Richard, but you buried yourself." He stumbled back, knocking over a glass, shards scattering across the floor. For the first time, he feared not Danielle, not the video, not the deadline, but himself. The voice he once trusted was no longer an ally. It was an enemy. He reached for his phone, desperate to call someone, anyone. Victoria, the board, his investigator. But what would he say? That a waitress was haunting him? That a decision he made years ago was now eroding his mind? They would laugh. Or worse, they would see the weakness and use it. No, he couldn't let them see. But Danielle already had. She had seen through the armor, pierced the facade, and left him trembling. The phone buzzed in his hand. A message. It was her. 2 days. Don't run. His breath hitched. She was everywhere now. His dreams, his thoughts, his phone. And the worst part was, he knew she didn't even need to threaten him further. He was destroying himself, one sleepless night at a time. He sank into the leather chair, gripping the phone so tightly his hand ached. For the first time in his empire's history, Richard Caldwell wondered if he would be remembered not as a builder, but as a thief. And as the night pressed on, the voices didn't fade. They grew louder, stronger, surrounding him from every corner of the penthouse. Richard whispered into the empty air, pleading for silence. But the silence never came, because once a ghost has found its voice, it doesn't let go. Richard Caldwell had built his fortune on symbols, logos etched in steel. towers that bore his name in polished stone, contracts signed with gold-plated pens. To him, objects had always been extensions of power. They meant permanence, control, but now, a different kind of symbol stalked him. It began innocently, a folded napkin. The very napkin Danielle had slipped across his table the night she shattered his carefully curated life. A scrap of linen, no different than any other in the restaurant. And yet, he couldn't let it go. He told himself he had kept it to study her handwriting, to assess the threat. But deep down he knew the truth. It terrified him. The note itself was short, barely 6 words. "Do you remember what you took?" That was all. No threats, no demands, just a question. But it wasn't the words that haunted him. It was the feeling, the way her handwriting looped deliberately, as though every stroke had been carved into the fabric. The way the ink bled faintly into the weave, as if it wanted to stay there forever. Now, wherever he went, he saw it. At the office, he opened his leather portfolio. Inside lay not reports, but the napkin, staring back at him. He shoved it into the drawer, locked it tight. Yet when he returned home that night, there it was again, tucked beneath his cufflinks. He demanded answers from Claire, from housekeeping, from his driver. "Who's putting this here?" he snarled. They all looked confused, swearing they had no idea what he meant. But Richard knew. It was Danielle. Somehow she had found a way inside his world. She was planting it, pushing him, reminding him of what he had buried. The napkin became his phantom. At board meetings, it seemed to appear in the folders of his colleagues. At dinners, it lay folded neatly beside his wineglass, as though mocking him. Once, during a speech, he looked down at the podium and froze. The napkin sat there, waiting as cameras flashed. He lost his rhythm. His voice faltered. The room of investors shifted uneasily, exchanging glances. To them, it was just a man stumbling over his words. But to Richard, it was the napkin. Always the napkin. And then it grew worse. The handwriting began appearing elsewhere, on the margins of his notes, on the receipts he signed, even on his bathroom mirror, fogged in looping letters after a hot shower. "Do you remember?" He scrubbed the mirror clean. He shredded the napkin. He burned it once, watching the fibers curl and blacken in the fireplace. But the next morning, when he opened his briefcase, there it was again. Unmarked, untouched, perfect. He stared at it, trembling. For the first time, Richard Caldwell, master of mergers, conqueror of cities, realized he was powerless against a piece of fabric. Because it wasn't just a napkin anymore. It was memory. It was guilt. It was her power, folded neatly in his pocket, suffocating him. That evening, standing at the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse, he clutched the napkin in his fist so tightly that his knuckles whitened. He could see the whole city sprawling beneath him, his empire. But what good was an empire when a single question could topple it? And as he stared at the skyline, he whispered into the glass, "What do you want from me?" But the city gave no answer. Only the napkin did, its fibers damp with the sweat of his palm, its silent question louder than any crowd. "Do you remember what you took?" And Richard Caldwell knew, for the first time in his life, that he could no longer run from the answer. While Richard Caldwell's nights grew longer, darker, and filled with phantoms, Danielle Carter's world moved at a different rhythm. She didn't have penthouse windows or fleets of lawyers. She had the community center. She had the cracked sidewalks of East Brooklyn. She had the tired faces of mothers working double shifts and the laughter of children playing on borrowed time. And she had dignity. Dignity wasn't loud. It didn't sit on panels or tower over boardrooms. It lived quietly in every meal she served at the diner, in every homework sheet she helped a child finish at the center. It was the refusal to let her story, or her people's story, be erased. She knew Richard was unraveling. Her phone buzzed every day with updates from quiet allies inside his empire. Board members whispering that Caldwell had lost his composure. Assistants admitting he barked orders at shadows. Even a driver confiding that Richard now checked the back seat before every ride, convinced someone was waiting for him. Danielle didn't need to haunt him. His guilt was doing that for her. But she understood something he never could, the weight of memory. Because while Richard wrestled with one napkin, Danielle carried dozens of them. Napkins she had saved over the years from vigils, meetings, late-night planning sessions. Notes written in the margins of menus, receipts, even scraps of cardboard, testimonies of voices that refused to vanish. One in particular never left her wallet. A note scrawled by her father the night before the demolition trucks came. "Danielle, dignity is not in what they give you. It's in what they can't take away." She read it often, especially now. To her, the fight wasn't about revenge. It was about ensuring that people like her father, her neighbors, her friends, people whose homes had been reduced to rubble in the name of Richard's progress, were not forgotten. And yet, beneath her calm, she felt the tension of the days closing in. 2 days. That was the deadline she had given him. 2 days to face her, to face the truth, or she would take the napkin, and the story behind it, public. She knew what that meant. The media storm, the flood of attention, the backlash, the endless debates where people would argue if she was brave, manipulative, noble, or opportunistic. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the silence being broken. At the community center that evening, she gathered with the kids for their after-school program. They didn't know the details of her fight with Richard, but they could feel the energy. They saw the way she walked with purpose, the way her eyes burned with a determination they had only glimpsed before. "Miss Danielle," one boy asked, tugging her sleeve, "are we going to get the new books next week?" She smiled, kneeling to his height. "Yes, Marcus. One way or another we will, I promise you." It was a simple promise, but it carried the weight of everything she was about to risk. As night fell, she sat on the center's worn steps, phone in hand, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. She knew Richard was out there, locked in his glass tower, suffocating in the weight of his empire. And for a moment she almost pitied him, almost, because she understood something he never had. Power without memory is hollow. She closed her eyes, breathed in the night air, and whispered her father's words again. "Dignity is what they can't take away." Her phone buzzed. A message. Unknown number. She opened it, her pulse steady. It was a single image. A photograph. Richard Caldwell, standing at his window, napkin in hand, staring out over the city. And in that moment, Danielle realized something terrifying. She was not just watching Richard unravel. Someone else was watching him too. Someone close enough to capture him in his most fragile state. The question now was, friend or enemy? Words have a way of circling back. The ones spoken carelessly in moments of power. The ones meant to wound, meant to humiliate. They never really vanish. They linger, waiting for the moment to return. For Richard Caldwell, those words had always been tools. He wielded them like knives in boardrooms, slicing through opponents with a smile. But now the knives were pointed at him. It began with whispers. At a gala downtown, one of his investors leaned in and asked, "Richard, do you remember when you said progress requires sacrifice? The papers seem to think you were talking about people, not numbers." Richard froze. That phrase, his phrase, had been private, spoken years ago behind closed doors. How was it back now, on the lips of strangers? He brushed it off with a laugh, but the room suddenly felt smaller. Eyes lingered too long. Conversation shifted when he passed. Words floated in the air like daggers. At the office, he overheard his staff. They thought he wasn't listening. "He doesn't belong here anymore," one whispered. "Not after this," another replied. "He doesn't belong here." The words sliced deeper than they should have, because they were familiar. Too familiar. They were the very words his wife had spat at Danielle in the restaurant that night. Words Richard had let stand without protest. Words he had once believed. Now they were his. He walked through his glass corridors, hearing them echo. Every corner, every reflection whispered, "You don't belong here." And then came the napkin again. This time it wasn't on his desk. It wasn't in his pocket. It wasn't tucked neatly into his briefcase. It was posted. On the bulletin board of his own company lobby, among the announcements and congratulatory memos, hung a single folded napkin. No one claimed responsibility. No one touched it. Employees walked past, whispering, staring, waiting for his reaction. He tore it down with shaking hands, but the damage was done. The symbol wasn't just haunting him privately anymore. It was public. And with it came the words. The press began circling. Reports surfaced of the demolition years ago. Testimonies emerged. Danielle's name wasn't public yet, but it didn't need to be. The story was alive. The voices were rising. Everywhere he turned, his own language came back to him. Progress requires sacrifice. You don't belong here. But worst of all, in the darkest hours of the night, came the softest whisper of all. His own reflection, staring at him from the window glass, lips moving before he realized he had spoken aloud. "Do you remember what you took?" He staggered back, heart pounding. It wasn't just Danielle's question anymore. It wasn't just the community's. It was his. He could no longer tell where her voice ended and his began. And then the phone rang. An unknown number. Again. He answered, breathless. Silence on the other end, just breathing, heavy, waiting. Then slowly the voice spoke. A child's voice. "You don't belong here." Richard's hand shook. "Who is this?" he demanded. But the line went dead. He dropped the phone, staring at the napkin still crumpled in his fist, its fibers trembling as though alive. And for the first time, Richard Caldwell understood. The very words he had once used to diminish others had become the chains that bound him. But who was behind the voice on the line? Was it Danielle? Or had the ghosts of his past finally found their way into the present? History does not remember silence kindly. Think of it. The injustices that shaped generations, the ones that left scars in cities and families alike, were not just carried out by those in power. They were preserved by the silence of those who stood by, watching, saying nothing. And Richard Caldwell knew this better than anyone. He had built his fortune on silence. The silence of families who couldn't afford lawyers. The silence of communities drowned out by headlines of progress. The silence of employees too afraid to speak when they saw what was happening. But silence has a strange way of flipping. When the moment comes, when the truth is too heavy to suppress, silence becomes guilt. And guilt is louder than any protest. Right now, Richard was trapped inside that storm. Every napkin, every whisper, every returning phrase was not just haunting him. They were witnesses, witnesses that refused to stay silent any longer. And you, watching this now, you are also a witness. If you are hearing this, you are no longer neutral. You've been placed inside this story. And history will judge how you respond. Will you sit in silence, like the board members who looked away while Caldwell erased entire neighborhoods? Or will you speak, even in the smallest way, to show you stood on the side of dignity? The guilt pressed deeper. Because silence is easy. Silence costs nothing, but silence feeds the very machine that Danielle Carter has spent her life fighting. So here is your choice. Subscribe right now. Add your voice in the comments. Tell us where you are watching from. Leave your mark, so history will record that when injustice stood before you, you did not look away. And if you refuse, then go to the comments and admit why. Confess why you chose silence, and let the world see the truth of that choice. Richard Caldwell didn't have that option anymore. His silence had already betrayed him. The community's voice was rising, echoing, unstoppable. But you are at the crossroads he once faced. Will you remain comfortable and quiet, or will you risk discomfort to stand for something greater? Because when the story of Danielle Carter and Richard Caldwell is retold, and it will be, you will either be counted among those who chose to act, or those who stood by as witnesses of silence. And as Caldwell stood in his penthouse, napkin trembling in his hand, phone buzzing again with another unknown number, he realized history was closing in, and no amount of silence could protect him now. The city never truly sleeps, but some nights it feels like it holds its breath. This was one of those nights. Richard Caldwell arrived at the community center unannounced. His black car pulled up to the cracked pavement, headlights cutting through the dark. The driver tried to open his door, but Richard waved him off. He wanted no witnesses. In his hand he carried the napkin, creased, sweat-stained, its ink fading but its question louder than ever. Inside, Danielle Carter was waiting. She sat on one of the old wooden benches, phone in her hand, her posture calm, unshaken. When Richard entered, she didn't rise. She didn't bow to the presence of his suit, his watch, his aura of wealth. She simply looked at him, the way one might look at a man finally forced to see himself. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence stretched, filled only by the hum of a flickering light overhead. Then Richard broke it. His voice was low, strained. "What do you want from me?" Danielle's gaze never wavered. "It's not about what I want. It's about what you took." He swallowed, throat dry. "Money? You'll have it. I'll write the check tonight, any number." She shook her head slowly. "You still don't understand. It's never been about money. It's about memory." Richard flinched at the word. Memory. The one thing he couldn't buy, couldn't bury, couldn't silence. Danielle leaned forward, voice steady. "You erased a neighborhood. You silenced families. You told us we didn't belong. And then you built an empire on the rubble. The least you can do is admit it, publicly." Richard's hands trembled around the napkin. Admit it. On record, to the world. That wasn't just humiliation. It was the collapse of everything he had built. His voice cracked. "You don't know what you're asking. Do you have any idea what that would do?" "Yes," Danielle said. "It would tell the truth." The words hung heavy. Richard's mind raced. He imagined the headlines, the lawsuits, the investors turning away, the empire crumbling beneath him. But beneath all that, deeper, darker, he imagined something else. Freedom. The voices, the whispers, the napkin, the child's voice on the phone. Would they finally stop if he admitted what he had done? Would the ghosts finally rest? For the first time, Richard considered that surrender might be the only path left. He opened his mouth to answer, and the door burst open. Two men stepped in, suits, polished shoes, eyes cold, not community volunteers, not journalists, board men, his own board. "Richard," one said, voice clipped, "we need to talk, privately." Danielle stood slowly, her eyes narrowing. "So this is how it is." Richard looked between them, Danielle with her steady defiance, the board with their quiet menace. His empire pulling him one way, his conscience another. The napkin shook in his hand. He could feel the ink like a weight, the words carved into his skin. "Choose," Danielle whispered. "Choose now." The boardman stepped closer. "Come with us, Richard. Don't waste another word here." For a moment Richard's knees buckled. He didn't know which way to turn, and then he dropped the napkin. It floated to the floor between them, landing softly, silently. Danielle bent, picked it up, and looked at him one last time. Her voice was quiet, almost tender. "You don't belong there anymore, and deep down you know it." Richard's lips parted, a single breath escaping, half denial, half confession. But before he could speak, the boardman pulled him toward the door. And as Richard Caldwell disappeared into the night, dragged back toward the very empire that was collapsing around him, Danielle stood alone in the silence of the center, the napkin in her hand. She had the truth. But the world didn't have it yet. The question that remained was simple, and it belongs to you. Should she release it and watch an empire burn, or hold it and leave him to be destroyed by his own ghosts? What would you do?